To have Dr. Felicia Friendly Thomas with us today to share her story. We will be recording this, so if you don't feel comfortable showing yourself on camera, feel free to turn your camera off. And we will have some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask Dr. Friendly Thomas, please feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or type them into the chat. We'll be answering questions in the chat too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Felicia Friendly Thomas. She received a BS degree in psychology from the University of South Carolina in 1974 and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Southern California in 1978. She is a licensed psychologist who has been a professor at Cal Poly for 39 years. She was recently the chair of the psychology department, but retired in August 2020, but continues to teach part-time at Cal Poly in spring term. So I will hand it over to Dr. Friendly Thomas.
Okay, Denise, thank you so much. And thanks everyone who showed up to hear my story. And even though it's my story, I'd like to put my story in context, because one of the things we know as psychologists is that context matters. So I'm going to use a few PowerPoint slides just to shape and structure my story, and then I'll come back to you. So let me start by sharing the screen. Not a lot of PowerPoint slides, but just enough to get us going. So I am going to share my screen, and let's see, I've got to move some things out of the way. And there we go. Okay. Even though this is my story, I wanted to give my story a title. And so as you can see on your screen, my story is titled Resiliency and Determination, Defining Your Own Destiny. And if you tune me out for everything else, if you don't hear any of the other messages, the core message that I want you to take away today is you get to define your own destiny. No one else. Resiliency, determination will help you define who you are, will help you define your own destiny. And I'm someone who likes quotes and I like sayings. So one of my favorites, and you're going to hear some others, but one of my favorites is, if it's to be, it's up to me. No matter what your resources are, no matter what your background is, all of us can take steps, almost like plugging in our GPS. We can plug in our destiny. And even though there might be many different routes to getting there, we can all sort of get there. So please, if nothing else, take that message away. So resiliency, that's one of the ways in which you determine your destiny. But what is resiliency? It's a term that we hear a lot about recently. And a lot of people have different terms for resiliency. For some people, it just means bouncing back from a challenge. Other people see it as just being tough or adapting, or maybe just effectively coping with a crisis or crises. And there are lots of other definitions. But for me, the definition I like best is actually illustrated in one of my favorite quotes, one of many. But that says, fall down 7 times, get up 8. That's all it is. It doesn't matter how many times, because it doesn't have to be 7. It could be fall down 10, get up 11. Fall down 60, get up 61. Fall down 1,000. As long as you get up one more time, then you fall down. You can determine your destiny. That is your choice. Now, sometimes you fall down and you're tripped. I'm going to tell you some of my challenges. Some of those challenges are by the hands of others. They deliberately, consciously trip you up because they don't want you to succeed. At other times, they trip you up, but they didn't do it deliberately. We've heard a lot about things like microaggression, for example. So people don't always do it consciously, but nevertheless, it's a challenge, it's an obstacle, and you find yourself falling down. And of course, we're all human. And as a psychologist, I know that best. It's one of the things I teach about. And that is that sometimes we make our own mistakes and we trip ourselves up. But that's okay. It doesn't matter why you fell down or who tripped you, yourself or somebody else. The bottom line is you get to determine if you stay there. You get to determine if you stand up again. So now let me tell you about some of my resiliency challenges. So that message, that's the message I gave you at the beginning. Some people don't give you the message until you get to the bottom line. I want to give you that message at the front and at the end. So before talking about my challenges, I wanted you to know about falling down and getting back up. So what were some of my challenges? I think about my life and my students often, when I tell them, it's like, I'm almost 70, and people say, you're almost what? I've been around a long time, at Cal Poly longer than many of you have been born on this earth, but nevertheless, so I can't tell you all my challenges in a 50-minute talk, but what I've done is I've divided it into 4 segments. Early challenges, school desegregation. I was one of 6 African-American children who first integrated an all-white school in rural South Carolina back in 1965 in the heat of the civil rights movement. So I'll tell you a lot about those challenges because those early challenges often shape who we are. They often are defining moment, and those are those times which they definitely shaped my being here as a psychologist as well as an educator. I won't have a lot of time to talk about my becoming an educator part of it, but if you have questions about that, ask me. I have an interesting story, but not enough time to tell all my many stories. I'm also going to talk about a couple of college challenges in terms of racial profiling that involved me. My guess is once we get through those 2 groups of challenges, we may be close to out of time, and I want to make sure you get questions. But if we have time, or if you have curiosity about it, I can talk about some of the professional challenges, some of them when I first came to Cal Poly back in 1982. As well as any personal challenges away from my professional life, challenges at home and challenges while traveling as just in my personal space. So, if you have questions about those last 2 and I don't get to them, please feel free to ask them. So I want to go back to that first set of challenges. The first set of challenges, the early life, has to do with desegregating, integrating that rules school in 1965. But as I mentioned before, context is important. Context is everything. And that's why it's really critical for me to take a brief look at segregation history. Why? It's hard to understand desegregation and integration if you don't, let's at least get us on the same page of understanding segregation. So I'm going to talk about 2 particular Supreme Court decisions. You might say, gee, those were a long time ago. Why aren't you telling us about newer decisions? Like I said, context is everything. You need to understand the context in which I integrated that school way back in over 50 years ago now. The first of these is Plessy, which happened in 1896. In Plessy, back during that time, as many of us know, in the 1800s, public transportation was by rail car. We didn't have like buses, and people generally didn't have like cars. So what we found in many states, especially the southern states, is the rail cars were divided. So cars on the outside said whites only, and other cars said blacks only. And you're not supposed to integrate those cars. But Plessy, a black man, one day bought a first-class ticket, and he got in a whites-only car. Well, obviously, they said it was against the law, so he was arrested, he was jailed. And the judge in his case was Ferguson. He lost the case, but he appealed it all the way to the US Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled that separate was okay, as long as separate was equal. Therefore, it was constitutional to separate the races. Now, the reason that case is so critical to understanding desegregation is what that case did is it legalized the separation of the races, not just in rail cars. It legalized separation in schools, in housing, across the board. in education. So it wasn't until 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education that most of us have heard about, that the Supreme Court ruled in that case that separate was not equal and that separate indeed was unconstitutional. There were actually 5 cases that came from lower courts that joined into making the one case that they called Brown. One of those 5 cases actually came out of South Carolina. Again, I don't have time to go back and tell you more about that case, but if you have questions about the South Carolina case that was actually part of the Brown case, we can talk about that in the question and answers. But one of the things that was really great about this is that the Supreme Court said, and this was a case not about rail cars, it was about education, but now it said that in schools, the schools needed to desegregate or integrate with all due haste. Now, 1954, what happened after 1954? Well, first of all, nothing. From 1954 to 1964, nothing happened in the schools. In 1964, you know what percent of the schools were integrated in South Carolina? Like 1%, which is basically nothing. And those were a few Black students who were in a few white schools. So there was still a push against integration. Well, you say, well, the Supreme Court ruled in 1954, why wasn't it being enforced? Why? Because the police officers, the lawmakers, the politicians, the parents, they were the ones behind keep our students separate. It wasn't until 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson came along and he signed the Secondary Education Act. And what that act said was the federal government could withhold funds from these public schools, and especially if you're in rural South, you rely a lot on public funds, but you could withhold public funds from schools that would remain segregated. So even though in 54, they were told to desegregate with all due haste, they didn't until, as we all know, when you hit people in their pocketbooks, in their bank accounts, people stand up and take notice. But President Johnson recognized and understood that schools had been segregated all this time. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863. So we're talking about 100 years after the end of slavery, schools were segregated. They were not going to integrate overnight. So he gave the states that were still legally mandating segregation in schools, he gave them time to desegregate. So they each of these states had to submit a state plan for integration. And in South Carolina, that plan was known as the Freedom of Choice Plan. Now, what freedom of choice in South Carolina meant was a student could choose to go to a school in the neighborhood, provided 2 things. One, you had only certain neighborhoods. So this was the gradual integration. So the first year, it's going to be only certain targeted neighborhoods or areas even within a neighborhood. And number 2, you had to be going to, there were about 3 schools, 3 grades, I'm sorry, 7th, 9th, and 10th. Well, luckily or unluckily, it depends on how you look at it. I was going to the 7th grade. I come from a large family with 8 kids, but I happened to be the only child in my family who was actually in the targeted area. Well, how was it decided? I was in the targeted area, but remember, freedom to choose. So how was the decision made about who would choose? Did I kind of say, oh, gee, I want to go? What happened back in the 60s across the state was that Black elders and our churches got together. As often happens in Black communities, the church is often the center for lots of things, the political center, the social center, the educational center, in addition to the religious center. So the church members got together and they decided that the best thing, and not just my church, this is happening in churches across the state, let us encourage the brightest of our Black students to be the first to integrate. Why? Because the prevailing stereotype or notion among the lawmakers, the politicians, the police officers, and the parents was the idea that Black kids were dumb and stupid. And they didn't say Black, you know what they said? They said the N-word, that we were Black and we were stupid. And therefore, if we found ourselves in classrooms with white students, and these are classrooms where Black students were going to white schools because white students weren't coming to Black schools, that we would find, the teachers would find themselves, the white teachers would find themselves having to dummy down the curriculum to meet the needs of these dumb Black kids or these dumb N kids. So that's why they encouraged us. Now, I was a good student. I was a great student, in fact. I was at the top of my class for years. How do I know that? If we have time, I'll tell you that story. But for me, being at the top of my class wasn't an option. It was a requirement. Like some of you listening, I'm a first-generation college student. My parents didn't go to college. My parents didn't have the funds to send me to college, send any of my siblings and I to college. And what they said to us was, find something that you do it exceptionally well so that you may get a scholarship that someone will give you. But in order to do it, you need to always be close to the top. So I have a brother who got a baseball scholarship. Another brother got a football scholarship. I had a sister who got a talent scholarship. Well, I didn't do any of those things well, but what I did do well is when I started, I was a good student, but I became a great student because I needed to become a great student. If I had not done that, I would not be sitting here before you with a PhD. That would not have happened because I needed scholarships in order to get through that. What made that decision also easy was my two best friends. In psychology, we talk about complementarity among friends, birds of a feather flock together. My two best friends were also, the three of us, we were at the top of our Black classes. And so the three of us agreed to go. We also, and the other reason is we thought this might be fun. I was an adventuresome student. And I was thinking, the thing that a lot of people don't understand about the South is that housing tended to be, because we didn't live in apartment buildings, most people lived in houses. We were not segregated in our local neighborhoods because people built their own homes on land. So my grandfather, for example, gave my father and his sister 2 acres of land adjacent to each other. And my father built a house on 1 acre, and right next to us was my aunt's house and with my cousin. And next to them was another plot of a few acres, and it was a white family. But what was different, though, was on Sunday, we went to different churches, white churches, Black churches. And on Monday, we went on different school buses to school. See, most people think, like in the West and places, that school busing was for the purpose of integration. In the South, school busing was for the purpose of segregation. I got on a bus that we call the Black bus, that went 10 miles to my Black K through 6th grade. What happened on the other bus? Those white students got on what we call the white bus, and they traveled 25 miles to get to their school. So if they wanted to get to the closest school, the closer school was actually the Black school. So these are students I had been seeing and all my life. We got along. In a rural place like where I grew up, we had 1 grocery store, 1 post office, and 1 gas station, and it was owned by a white family, and whites and Blacks shopped there. When we went shopping, they called my mother, you know, Mrs. Friendly, my father, Mr. Friendly. I did the same with white families. I didn't hear the N-word. I didn't grow up hearing the N-word. When we rode our bicycles down the rural highways, and, you know, I saw people and we said and smiled, and sometimes we raced our bikes and did things like that. What I did not understand, because when I went to 7th grade, I was 12 years old. What I did not understand as a 12-year-old was that we all got along because we stayed in our lanes. As long as you stayed in your lane, you were fine. Like, see, Plessy, if Plessy had just gone to the Black car and stayed in the Black rail car, he would not have been jailed. I did not, because at 12, you're not politically conscious. You know, the elders got together. They didn't invite us into the meetings. They just came out and says, would you like to volunteer? So I thought this will be fun. These are students I've seen before. I'm going to a new school. I'm going to have new teachers. You know, hip, hip, hooray, wonderful for me. Wow. What a rude awakening. I had no idea of the bigotry. I had no idea about the racial hatred that existed in the United States. The Western Psychological Association, as well as the American Psychological Association and other places, once they find out that I was one of the early members of desegregation back in the 60s, they've asked me to give different talks. And one of the talks I gave at the Western Psychological Association, this was my title: School Desegregation Through the Eyes of a 12-Year-Old Child Who Lived the Nightmare and Survived. Because folks, resiliency, determination, obviously I survived. But if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. So now I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm just going to talk with you about the rest of my story. Okay, so let me tell you about the first day, the first year, the second year, and then sort of turning the tide. That first year was pretty surreal because I was, both buses came down my road. I always got on, we looked, you determined, if it was the black bus, it stopped at your house. If it was the white bus, it stopped down the road at the White House. So now I got on a different bus. My other siblings got on the black bus. I was the only one in my household that got on the white bus. They put a white teacher on the bus with us. Remember, I'm going to the white school now. We're 25 miles away. And they put someone on the bus to make sure we were safe. And she sat at the front of the bus. She kind of sat looking she sat on the front row. They put us on the front row, looking behind her to make sure that things weren't thrown at us. Our Black parents also came in a caravan behind us to protect us. What I didn't know until, about 4 or 5 years ago, my father passed away and he was among the caravan. It was only the fathers, not the mothers, is that all of those fathers in their cars and trucks had guns and rifles because they were determined to protect us, but they didn't tell us because that might have frightened us, 12-year-olds. So we get to school on that first day. We had to go by the principal's office to get our little note to sign in. And by the time you do that, school has already started. People are in their homeroom. And these 3 little frightened 12-year-old little girls are walking down the hallway. And the doors were open, but people were quiet because school had started, except there was one room that was loud. And you could hear people, and I could hear the N word. We're getting some of those N kids over and over. And it's like, ooh, so now this is my first experience with personal experience. Now, my parents, the moment I said they signed me up to go to the white school, my father's job was threatened. They said, if you send your N kid to school, you're going to get fired. Our house was threatened to be burned down. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So, but my parents my father and those dads wanted to make sure that we got to school safely. So we go in, we hear the N word. Now I'm hearing it for the first time because the other insults were levied to the parents. We walk into the room and all of a sudden dead pin silence. And even though that's been over, 50 years ago or so, I remember walking into that classroom, a defining moment in my life. The white teacher kind of looked at us. She had left 3 chairs at the back of the room. So my friends and I, we walked to the back of the room. There were 1 chair at the back of 3 rows. So we could sit adjacent to each other. And that's what happened for the rest of the year. Students didn't talk to us. Teachers only talked to us if they had to. Many of the teachers sent their own kids out of the school. There was a lot of white flight. The teachers didn't want their kids going to school with us, but private schools were expensive. And so many of the teachers could not afford to send their kids, or they had tenure where they were going to give up their jobs for that, because even the private schools, like overnight, pop-up schools couldn't afford to pay them the same kinds of salaries. So teachers were not our friends. I would sometimes walk into a room with the teacher huddled with a bunch of white students, and I could hear the N-word. You could see the teacher laughing. And of course, if you called the teacher out or told the principal, whose word was it? Yours against the teacher? And the students like, what? So we talked about people tripping you up. As we walked down the aisle, people would put out their feet and they would trip us. If we weren't looking, you'd get spitballs in your hair. If a teacher said, pass your papers forward, remember we're at the back of the room. People would not touch our papers. They'd said, mom and dad said, I don't have to touch no nigger's hand. And excuse me, because that just popped out. I meant to say the N word, but I heard it so many times that it just got stuck in my sort of brain. And so this is we would then complain to the teacher, to the principal and the teacher, and the principal said, if everybody's papers are being passed forward, you must also pass papers forward of the Black kids. So then this is what the students would do. Let's say if you had a sheet of paper and I'm passing my paper forward, the student in front of me would take this side of it and go, ooh, stink, oh. And then the next person would take another side, and another person would take that side. And that's how it got passed up. We're 12. I turned 13 during the year. 12, 13, we know as psychologists, is a defining moment in children's lives. It's a time of identity and knowing who you are and who you are becoming. And so what we were surrounded by were people who didn't think we deserved to be there, who thought we were dumb and stupid. Well, for me, remember, I don't have a choice. I have to be a good student. So what did I do when I got to the school? Shot to the top of the class, because I didn't have a choice. It didn't matter what school I was in. The only thing that mattered was I needed to get out of high school. I needed to get me an academic scholarship. So I just put my head down with determination. Was it difficult? Yes, it was. I always think about that first year as being, that was more of a bad dream than a nightmare. And the reason I saw that as more of a bad dream, because I had my two friends. And so at least we could support each other. Social networking and support, really important. And that's why programs like the one you're in, mentoring, having other people to help and support you, that was critical and that was important, especially when we got to some of the less structured time. For example, going to the lunchroom. To keep us kind of safe and keep an eye on us, we had to go to lunch with a group and we had to go with our teacher. You either bought lunch in the cafeteria or they had chairs along the wall and you can sit and eat your lunch. Well, we always bought our lunch and you would come out of the cafeteria, maybe sort of carrying your tray. White students didn't want you to sit at their tables, but what you do is you find a table with one seat. And we had this thing we call clearing the table. Let's say I'm clearing the table on Monday. So I take my tray, I put it down at the one empty seat. Well, the white students would jump up and flee. Ooh, coon, and ooh, stink. Freedom of speech. They would flee to some other table. Now I've cleared the table and my two friends now have a place to sit. On Tuesday, the other friend would do it. And on Wednesday, so we rotated. So that made it easier. When we got to something like PE, where the PE teacher would show you things to do and put you in pairs. Well, there were three of us, odd number, but we would rotate among the three of us in pairing off. Okay, the two of you pair together, now the two of you, and that worked. When we went out for recess and unstructured time, there was a fence around the school. We would sit close to the fence, but we would sit kind of like in a circle or a triangle so we could watch each other's backs, because all of a sudden the stray ball hit you. Ooh, stray spitball even. So we had to, as 12-year-olds, we had to learn to watch our backs. But that's how we got through that year's a bad dream. So why was the second year? I consider the second year a nightmare, because one of the things that South Carolina decided to do was, my school anyway, I'm not sure if it was across the entire state, is that they decided that any news, they would come up with 3, they didn't call it tracks, but that's basically what it was. an A track, a B track, and a C track. Students who were the best students, who probably would have the grades to go to college, would be put in the A track. And students who might be going to community college and probably not going on to a four-year college or go to a technical school or trade school would be in the B section. And the C students were students say, no, I'm going to get out, I'm going to get a job. They said any new student coming into the school would automatically be put into the B section. And then they could work their way down to C or up to A. Well, come on, folks, who are the new people? Students weren't the only new people coming into schools. It's not like, you know, here where people move all the time, not in the South. No, that didn't happen. The new students were the Black students. I was excited that there were going to be 3 new Black students in the 8th grade. I thought, fantastic. Except they slated them all into the B section. Now, remember, this is freedom to choose. So one of my friends said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going back to the Black school. Because if we were the top 3 students, you know, that meant we were presidents of classes and we were teachers' pets and we got to stand the front of the line going to the restroom and all those kinds of things, even when you're a little kid. So now all of a sudden, we're at a school where we don't even count. People don't even talk to us, not even teachers, unless they want to ask us about something. My other friend stayed, but she made D's and they put her in the B section. So folks, in the 8th grade, it was numero uno. It was just me. Now, when I went to the lunchroom, if I cleared a table, I sat by myself because they had to go to lunch with their classes. They all went together. I went by myself. When I went to, for recess, I would sit literally with my back against the fence because there was nobody to watch my back. When I went to PE, there was nobody to help, nobody to dress out with me. Students would rather get an F and not dress out for the day rather than hold my hand or touch my hand in any kind of 2-person or group activity. So, and they would blatantly say, my mom and my dad told me I don't have to. So do whatever you have to, but I'm going to go home and tell my mom or tell my dad. So what the PE teacher would say, okay, Felicia, if you'll just wait, when I get through, you know, looking at all the groups to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to, then I'll be your partner. Come on, folks, at 13, who wants to partner with the teacher? I mean, I did, but every once in a while, it just became much more painful and I just couldn't bear it. And so I remember going to the girls' dressing room and closing the door. We had individual stalls and I just cried my eyes out. Determination, I was crying and I was telling myself, I don't care what they say, I don't care what they do. They're never gonna make me leave. I dug my heels in. I don't like it. It's painful, it's horrific, but I'm not going. But today, I just need to cry. Some days you just have to cry and let it be. The teacher, the first time I did it, came looking for me. I guess she maybe saw me in the gym at some point and came looking, saying, Felicia, Felicia. And it's one of those stalls where you could see people's feet because it wasn't from, you know, all the way down to the floor. So she saw my legs and she said, Felicia, come on out. She tried to talk to me. I told her, you know, I'd be out. The next time I learned in the stall, there was a bench. I just stood on the bench. So when she came looking, she couldn't see my feet. I was some days willing to get an F, although fortunately for me, she never gave me an F because I actually ended up getting an A in the class. But, and the other thing that sometimes people would do, you'd walk down the hall, people would take like a pen or a safety pin and they put it under their arm. And then somebody would hit this person would trip and fall and stick you. And it's like, what happened to the pen? What happened to the pen? What happened to whatever that, you know, object was? It kind of disappeared. Except, gosh, if I've got a prick and I've got a little blood, somebody pricked me. So you also even walking down the hallway. So that's what high school was like for me. But remember, it was freedom to choose. It was targeted area, the catchment area gradually and slowly increased in size with Black students. So that by the time I got to the 11th grade, my junior year, at least a third of the class At that point, they were Black students. We still had the Black high school that white students wouldn't go to. So we had a Black high school, and then we had a high school with 2/3 white and 1/3 Blacks attending that school. At this point now, I don't hear the N word too often, only, there were some students who kind of never changed. Other students now are starting to talk to you in classes. A students want to talk to A students. You want to find out what you do in that test. Did you get that problem right? How did that go? So that happened. We had one person who played football, really fantastic football player. So he got to be friends with other football players, somebody who's in band. So my point is, we started making pockets of friends. And so while we were physically in school, things were far better. It was so much better. It looked like a sort of typical school. However, we as in the Black students who had been coming starting 7th grade, we never held offices. We never got to do all those special things. And we decided that we wanted to be officers for the junior class. And again, I don't have time. If we have time, I'll tell you the coup that happened, but we pulled a coup. I ended up being president of the junior class. The football player ended up being vice president of the junior class. We got somebody who, we didn't expect it to work that well. We were only hoping for one office, but it worked really well. And then we got the historian, the secretary. The only one we did not get was treasurer. We had a tie, and then we had a runoff. And once you do a coup, the gig is up. And so now we lost that one. We lost that one. Now, why was that critical and important? Not just my being the first Black president of a class, a Black officer of a class, is the fact that we had junior senior proms, and it was the junior president who was in charge of and responsible for the prom. Now, all of a sudden, there's another lane we were about to cross. Parents were saying, it's okay that those N kids are going to school every day with our kids, but there's no way after dark that Blacks and whites are going to socialize together. That's not going to happen. And so what you found parents and students talking about, we're going to have our own prom. So that'll be the Black prom, and then we'll have a white prom. The school fortunately grew a backbone and said, we'll have one prom, school resources, because this is still a poor school. And so what it said was, the fundraisers that you do to make money, to get a band and do all those kinds of things and have a venue, that one of the things, this other prom, we don't accept liability, no health liability, no legal liability, school is not involved. Ultimately, over time, and I must say that those A students who had become my friends, friends is in school friends, so acquaintances more than anything else, we didn't hang out. They rolled up their sleeves and they said, Felicia, tell me what you need. Ultimately, not at first, tell me what you need and we'll help. And so they helped. In the end, we had one prom, Black, whites at that prom. Wonderful, fantastic. It went so well. Guess what, folks? Senior year, I got to be president of the senior class too. So I always laughingly say Barack Obama was not the first two-term president, Black president. I was in 1970 and 1971. So then I graduated. So with the few minutes that I have left, let me just tell you a couple of college stories. Because I thought, okay, and that's turning the tide. We turned the tide. I was overseeing, as the senior president, I oversaw the yearbook. The photo in our yearbook has a Black hand and a white hand, and underneath it said togetherness. So we really came a long way. So if I had to do it over again, absolutely, I surely would. So I get to college and I'm thinking, okay, so, this is, 6 years later, I'm kind of prepared. Well, my class was the largest Black class going to a white university. I went to the University of South Carolina, the largest public university in the state. Why did I go? One, I got a scholarship. Remember, that was my goal. I have to get a scholarship. So they gave me a scholarship. They gave a scholarship to all the students. If you were in the top, I don't know if it was 5% or the top 5 students, I'm not sure which, because I fit both criterion, but I ended up being offered a place in that freshman class at the beginning of my junior year. So obviously that's where I went. Challenges. I was a poor kid. My parents said, you know, the scholarship is only so much. They also got out a parent loan so that I wouldn't have to work that first year, but they couldn't afford a two-person dorm room or one-person dorm room. So I had a triple. It was the cheapest room you could get. So I had 2 white roommates, 2 white females. It was co-ed freshman dorm. I'm sorry. It was a female-only dorm. One of my roommate's parents, when she found out that she was rooming with an N kid, told her absolutely not, and made such a stink at the university. She moved rooms. She was actually nice. What she said to me, she said, Felicia, I'm really sorry. My parents pay my tuition. They said, if I stay in the room with you, they won't pay my tuition. So I have to move. I'm really, really sorry about that. I understood. The other roommate was a mean girl. She did not want to be in the room with me, but she stayed. My hypothesis is she stayed because she couldn't afford to move, because all the double rooms were gone. So if you moved out of the triple room at that point, school had started, you needed to move into a single room, and the single room cost 3 times as much. So she stayed, but she let me know she wasn't interested in my being there. Fortunately, I met some of the other Black students, and one of our friends had a single room. So we would hang out, a Black friend, we would hang out in her room. So that's how I escaped from my room. However, at the end of that first year, when you can now move out of the freshman dorm into another dorm, my mean girl roommate had actually gotten nicer because she spent a year in a room with me. And she said, just like my high school people who ultimately became quasi-friends, was, we watch you, you study, you're neat, you don't have bad habits, you know, no more than anybody else does. So we understand and recognize that all those stereotypes people had about Black people, that those stereotypes were not correct. And so one of the things she wanted to do was to room with me a second time, but I didn't. I said, I'm sorry. And now I developed a best friend, a Black female, and so we moved together. And with the 1 minute, because I want to leave at least 5 minutes for us to talk, the other one with racial profiling is because I had to work. I did work study. My parents got a loan, so I didn't have to work the first year, but I had to work the rest of the time. I always tried to find jobs where I did not have to work the entire time. So I worked in the library because you could go in the stacks and you could sneak and study. I worked at the information desk in the second dorm. And at that information desk, I signed up to work Saturdays from 8 to 12. Why Saturdays from 8 to 12? Come on, you're college students. What college student gets up at 8 o'clock in the dorm and comes down to the information desk? Nobody. Who calls? So I could just sit for 4 hours on a Saturday morning and I could study. But unfortunately, what happened was one of my responsibilities was to dish out refunds if people lost things in the vending machine. We're talking about in the early 70s. Cokes were 25 cents. Candy bars were like 10 cents. So we had a petty cash box that normally had no more than $2.50 in it. So you always needed to have a receipt. If you gave somebody 25 cents, you wrote out a receipt with 25 cents. So there should always be a combination of coins and receipts that totaled about $2.50. Well, as it would be that because maybe the next week, wasn't even right after my shift, about $1.50 came up missing. So who do they think stole it? I've never stolen anything in my life. $1.50? They put me in the back of a police car, not a school police car, but the city police car. They put me in the back of a police car. They hauled me downtown. They gave me a polygraph test. They did ask my permission. But I said, yes, I was a frightened little, probably 19-year-old. What was I going to say? No, I didn't have a student. I didn't have a teacher representative. I didn't have a staff representative. They sent this frightened little 19-year-old down to a police station in the back of the car, and they put it in the school newspaper. And they didn't say it was $1.50. Felicia Friendly, accused of stealing money. Could have been $100, could have been $200. Fortunately, the Black Student Union ultimately came, when they read the news article, they came to my defense. So what's my point, folks? We only have 3 minutes, so you need to stop. My point is, back to what I said. If you get to determine, in any one of those junctures, I could have just given up, fallen down, tripped, made my own mistakes, and not gotten back up. But I absolutely refused. One of the things, I don't know if you can see it, it might be backwards. My graduate students know that my favorite saying is fall down 7, get up 8. In the 2017 graduating class, they gave me that and they engraved it because I say it so often. But anyway, with the 3 minutes that we have left, I so apologize. But like I said, I love my stories. They're kind of lengthy. So questions, anybody? Are there any questions in the chat? And if you don't have any questions, then I could tell you another story if you don't have a question. So
I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. So whoever.
No, I was gonna say I don't have any questions, but thank you for sharing. That was a really inspirational stories.
Thank you. Thank you. You're more than welcome. I mean, one of the things I learned, like the 3 things that I kind of, again, take away is that sometimes you need 3 things. You have to have vision, commitment, and faith. Vision. You need to be able to see beyond where you are. If you're a first-generation college student, if you're a student who doesn't have a lot of resources or funds, or you're just a student who's struggling in a class, you have to have a vision beyond this. And when I sit and talk to students, I always say to them, what do you hope beyond Cal Poly? Or what do you hope just beyond this one class? You have to have a vision beyond that. And that's why mentoring and reaching out, you don't have to stand up by yourself. If somebody reaches down, gives you a hand, grab it. Let them pull you up, because sometimes people can have a vision beyond what you can see. When I was 12, I didn't have a vision for integration and desegregation. I was just like, new school, new students, fun. So, but my elders, my parents, they had a vision beyond my vision. So sometimes they can hold your vision until you can catch that vision yourself. But regardless of whether you have the current vision, you have to have the determination. You have to have the commitment. And that's why that determination is so critical. Once I got there and I saw what I was up against, I then was committed. They were not going to change my mind. And then the third is faith. You have to believe that these things, that the vision that people have for you can be accomplished. Even when you have your GPS and you end up getting lost, you say, okay, recalculating. You have to be able to recalculate and have the faith that if you recalculate, you can make things happen. So,
Dr. Friendly Thomas,
yes.
in the chat, we have students saying, thank you, that your story is very motivational, very informative and inspirational, that they're glad they're able to hear it. So thank you for sharing your story with us. And I also have a question. How do you maintain such a positive outlook when you, and not become like full of hate or resentment when you've experienced so many racist experiences? Yeah.
That's an excellent question, because you might think if you had all those white folks treating you that way, the way I, do my self-talk is I say, if I judge anybody based upon whomever they are, if I judge you based upon your gender, if I judge you based upon your religion or your sexual orientation or your race or ethnicity, would I not be just like, the perpetrators who perpetrated against me? People judged me just because of this, not because of my character. So I don't do that. I've been at Cal Poly all these years, and most students at Cal Poly are not Black. So I've gotten along exceptionally well with all students, because as long as those students treat me in a certain way. Now, I'll tell you a really quick story. I'll see if I can do this quickly. When I first started at Cal Poly, I was 29 years old. I looked kind of like I could be a student. My intro psych class was very popular. And back during the day, in a classroom over in building 5, with most of the doors at the back, if you, on the first day of classes, if you didn't show up, the instructor could drop you from the class. So what would happen is when I got to my classroom door, the door would be filled with students hoping that there would be open spaces. There were a couple of students, as I tried to wade my way through to get to the front of the room, called me the N-word and get back, because they thought I was trying to jump the line when I was the instructor, even though I was dressed in a suit and I had usually had my briefcase with my book in it. I would walk to the front of the room and I would turn around and then I'd look that student right in the eye and smile. So I've remained positive because, as I said before, if you don't give people the opportunity to change, people will never change. Some people will never change, but many people did change. And that's the way I taught my daughters to treat people based upon who they are and not the color of their skin. I didn't have children when I started Cal Poly. My daughters are in their 30s. One of my daughters married a Black man and one of my daughters married a white man. I love both of my co-in-laws to pieces. They're great and they're wonderful. And we go off on vacations without our kids. So the way I keep myself positive is to remember to not judge people by anything, but how they are as people. So.
I have a question. Thank you, Dr. Friendly Thomas, for sharing your personal stories about racism in South Carolina. Why do you think it's important to, I know some people say, well, that's in the past, things are different. Why do you think it's important to share historical perspectives about race?
Because, they say the past is prelude to the future. You need to remember history, because if you don't, it will be repeated. And folks, it's not all in the past. You heard that I was chair of the psych department. I've had parents call me on the phone because they were complaining about something about their student not getting a class and wanting to talk to me and setting up an appointment to see me. And I've been standing in the primary psych office. My chair's office was, had an adjoining door, and they've walked in, looked right at me and said, I need to speak to the chair. And I said, I'm the chair. So no, I need to speak to Dr. Friendly Thomas. Is like, oops. And that would be me. So it's a different version of the student pushing me aside, but not, not necessarily. So the thing about Cal Poly, when I came to Cal Poly in the psych department, we're a pretty big department. I was the first faculty member of color. There were 3 female faculty members when I came. They were mostly white men, and there were no faculty members of colors, no Latino, no Blacks. There were no Asian faculty, none. So when I came, all of a sudden, I keep finding myself in these positions of first. It's like, okay, I took my hair out of braids, say, okay, I've got to figure out how I'm going to survive in this world. I was the first female to be pregnant while teaching a class, because the other females, they had, 2 of them had children, but their children were older. So challenges, folks, will always happen. So no matter where they are, no matter who does it, you need to stay positive. You've got to be I pat myself on the back. I do my own self-talk. Before I go into a talk, before I go into a presentation, before I go into a job interview, I say, Felicia, you got this. I talk to myself. You have to be your own best cheerleader. Nobody should be cheering for you more than you cheer for yourself. And if you don't have that yet, let somebody else cheer you on until you can grab it for yourself. And somebody, I saw something in the chat I was going to answer. Somebody asked if any of the students ever apologized. Yes, some of them in high school did. They said, Felicia, we apologize because we were behaving the way my parents said we should. My parents told me that this is how you colored people were, or they may have migrated to Negro. We weren't using black at that time, back in the 60s. And they said, and I see that my parents were wrong. But sometimes you see what you want to see. So some of the students saw it and say, no, you're an exception. No, I'm not an exception, folks. There are a lot of Black people just like me. I'm not an exception. So don't let people lead you to believe that you can make it and you can do it, but those others out there can't because they don't have what you have. And see, that's one of those unconscious challenges. When I moved into my house, and this is my kind of house I was, you know, I had 3 different houses before I got the house I wanted in a really nice neighborhood. There were no Black families when I moved. My neighbor, when I moved in, saw me down at my mailbox, had seen the sign up and went down. She asked me, my white neighbor said, do you work for the people who bought the house? So I played along. I said, no. And that's all I said. And then she said, oh, are you friends with the people who bought the house? I said, no. But then I saw the look in her eyes. And then I knew I needed to let her know because the police were going to be on my doorstep. So I finally says, I bought the house. And then she kind of flushed red. And she says, come to my house and we have to do tea. And there's some things you forgive and some things you let go. So I don't think so. When you show me who you are, believe it. So she showed me who she was. And so I absolutely believed it. I had another neighbor who knew one of my old neighbors from my previous home. And when she found out where I was moving, she told my other neighbor, and this is unconscious bias, what she said to me. She said, Felicia, I know the people who live across the street. They're friends of mine. And I told them, you guys are really good people. You don't do drugs or anything. What? What? This is someone who's supposed to be a friend, who's a white friend, who's telling me that she had to vouch for me with the neighbors, that we don't do drugs. Why do I have to do drugs to have a nice house? Okay, folks, like I said, I know we're out of time. I just got lots of those kinds of stories. So in answer to your question, Dustin, it's important for us to understand this because it's really not over. Shades of gray may be different, but we all need to be aware of them. And and that's why we're having such an issue now with social justice and racial justice, because some people have gotten to the place of believing we're beyond that. We don't need to understand that. Yes, we do. It's still occurring. So used to be more underground, it's less underground even now. I mean, we can look at Atlanta. I mean, it's just all around us, unfortunately. So we need to be aware, folks. We need to not put our heads in the sand. So.
Do you have any suggestions or recommendations of what we can do or what our RAMP participants can do as college students to help move the needle forward?
Well, again, I think making sure that you participate in mentoring and programs and reaching out. Sometimes people think, I can do this on my own. I've done research on what we call psychosocial mentoring and instrumental mentoring. Instrumental mentoring is going to an advisor or a mentor to help you with classes and GPA and getting into college and filling out applications. But psychosocial mentoring is mentoring where they're helping you with your kind of emotional and psychological struggles. I'm not saying going to see a therapist. I'm saying somebody that you trust, somebody who listens, and someone who will help you find the resources. But sometimes I found that people are feeling like if I got here, if I ask for help, it means I'm weak and I can't do it. Yes, you can. We all need, help. We all need other people to help and mentor us. And don't be afraid. I've worked with students who've come to me because I have an undergraduate research lab. And they'll come to me and they'll be quiet and not very assertive. And they'll say, I'm not a very extroverted kind of person. Or students who don't have some people won't take you into their research lab unless you have a 3.5 or 3.8. I says, no, that doesn't. For me, if you have the effort, put the effort, and I'm willing to work with anyone who's willing to put forth the effort. So what I try to do is encourage people to seek help when it's offered. Do not see it as a weakness, and be willing to look around for resources. There's so many resources that students just don't take advantage of, but it's there. Or students are saying, well, I can't, when we were on campus especially, okay, doing U hour, there are always kinds of talks here or there. Folks, if you want to go to graduate school, or even if you don't plan to go to graduate school, go to those talks. You know, you can list that. You can say, well, I went to these 10 talks. Because a lot of times employers, a lot of times graduate schools, they want to see that you've done more than just go to class, take a test, go home and work. As I said, I was a working student, but I had to figure out, how do I do that? And that's why mentoring really is important. When I was in college, I had a mentor. I didn't have any Black faculty in college, not one. So my advisor was a white male, and he was the one who helped me as I was looking at graduate schools, because my goal was to get into college, period. It was just first generation college student. I want my bachelor's and I'm done. And he says, Felicia, you're a good student. Why can't you, you can go to graduate school. In the end, I got a scholarship that was attached to me. Full scholarship. My scholarship said, find the school of your choice and we'll pay your tuition no matter where you go. That's why I went to SC. Do you think I could afford to go to SC? Not. Could not have. And they gave me a book allowance and they gave me a stipend every month. So what's my point, folks? Vision and faith. I didn't have that vision at 12, but I had people who were willing to commit to me, have a vision, and to support me. And I always looked for help. And therefore, I don't mind giving back. I don't mind working with people. And folks, I want you, when you get to a place where you can give back, give back. It takes all of us. And you know that old saying, takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village. So that's my advice. My advice is don't go it alone. In fact, there's an African proverb. What does it say? Well, I'm not going to remember it, plus we're out of time. It's something like, if you want to go fast, run alone. But if you want to go far, run together. So basically, if you want to go far, you've got to run with other people.
You're an amazing storyteller. This isn't the first time I've heard you share your story, and it still doesn't lose its effect. So I'm curious, have you written a book, or is that in your vision to do?
It has not been in my vision, and everyone has says, Felicia, why won't you write a book? And one of the things I try to do whenever I talk is to find, is there a story? Because I have so many of these stories. It's like, is there a story I haven't told before? Maybe I should add that story. And I wish years ago I had started, but because when I started at Cal Poly, and as I mentioned, I didn't have children. I went through pregnancy and having young kids and teenagers and my priority always was, so I had teaching, I had my kids. I also founded a mobile counseling center on wheels that went into communities to give free counseling services to underrepresented groups. So doing a book was just like at the bottom of my list. Now I don't have all those things, and now I just don't have the motivation. I don't have the motivation. Oh, and the other thing I'd say too is don't let other people, in terms of some of you, if you're thinking about changing your majors or being a certain major, I said I had a story, and I see if I can do it in 2 minutes, because I know lots of people probably have classes and people have gone, but I was put in the A section, but they didn't expect me to go to college. They said, well, you're a good student. They couldn't put me in the B section, but they really expected that. So do you want to go to secretarial school or something like that? It's like, no, I'm going to a 4-year university. They said, oh, okay, you're going to college so you can be a teacher. Why? Because at the Black school, you had teachers. So Black people who got college degrees, they became ministers, they became teachers, because you had to have Black teachers to teach the Black kids. So I really didn't want to become an educator. And I didn't recognize that until many years later. I think the one thing I did know about myself is that I liked university settings. So my first job out of SC, I got hired at UCLA to work in one of their psychology research and training clinics. And while I was on probation there, I wasn't faculty. I was a clinician at a clinic. They decided to have some specialty classes in children. That's one of my specialties, in special children with learning and special issues. So they came to the clinic and they said, Felicia, will you teach this new class that we are developing? I didn't want to teach it because in my head, it was like, I don't want to be a teacher. Because everybody had told me that's what I don't want to be a teacher. But I was on probation. So what do? You smile. You said, of course, I'd be so happy to teach that class. And I did. So I ended up teaching like 3 classes while I was at UCLA. Then my husband and I, we left the state. He went to go to law school. So we went and left the state and went someplace else. And while I was there, once again, I looked for colleges and universities. So I got another job in a counseling center. And in my first semester, still on probation, a psychology faculty member went on maternity leave. They said, oh, Felicia, you taught at UCLA, you can teach. And I was like, inside I'm screaming. It's like, why do you guys keep doing this to me? I don't want to teach, but I did. And then I had to, now by now I'm a PhD psychologist. I'm getting jobs as a full-time faculty member. I had to stop and have a self-talk. And that's back to the other question too. One of the things I tell people to have self-talk, not just patting yourself on the back, but I talk to myself and I said, okay, Felicia, you keep liking these classes. You love it. Why are you resisting it? And I realized that the old stereotypes were forcing me into wanting to do something different than what they said I was going to do. But I had to stop and realize that I was also fighting against the purpose for integration was to allow people to make their own decisions. So as long as the decision was mine, that it would be okay if I chose to be an educator. So at that point, I actually, while, the first year I was in the counseling center, I switched universities. I got a tenure track position for the last 2 years of his law school. We left there in '82, came to California. And before I left, I got a job at Cal Poly, came back to Cal Poly, and I'm, 39 years later, I'm still at Cal Poly. So don't let other people, and that to define me, don't let anybody else define me. Because I love being an educator. What I did is I learned to combine the two. I learned to be an educator and teach at Cal Poly while also doing my community service with the Friendmobile and that was the counseling center on wheels. So I could do both. I married the 2 parts of me. I didn't have to do one or the other. I didn't have to divorce or split one off. I could do both. And so the book became this thing that I couldn't do all of it and have my young kids because I specialize in children. I couldn't leave my children on the float while I did all these other things. So,
but it's not too late.
It isn't too late. And maybe one of these days, maybe I'll, like if this is recorded. In fact, I did a national talk, but it wasn't on this topic at all, about 2 weeks ago. And they just sent me the video from that. So maybe I'll use the video as, I'll use it as a script and sort of write things down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or you can have a co-author who'll keep you what's the word I'm looking for? Accountable. Keep you on schedule.
Yes.
And all you have to do is sit there and tell your wonderful stories.
Right. And it may be a couple of years. I'm kind of basking in having that being a term where there's like nothing to do. I've worked all of my life. It's like I have nothing to do.
You deserve this.
So thank you. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in there long past time.
Oh, you can't even tell.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.